Well, sorry about that hiccup. The battery just went flat on my camera and so it stopped recording. I'm just putting this rewind knob together correctly. The spring here, that little spring, is a little bit lackluster. It hasn't quite got enough bite on it. I'm just seeing if I can move that in slightly, give it a bit more tension. Of course, you have to be a bit cautious about that because it's easy to overdo it, and it's easy to press it once too often, too hard, and the piece of brass just snaps off instead. So I think we got off lightly that time. That looks to be working correctly, and I'll get this in place. It's held in the 3 screws. On this particular camera, a lot of the screws are in fairly rough condition. The heads are a little bit chewed out. I can only think it's been taken apart a number of times, and that whoever was taking it apart was perhaps not as careful as they should have been. But the camera has had an awful lot of history. That's good. I think we can put the film spool in now, the take-up spool. So I want to apply some synthetic grease to the top of that leaf spring, and also to the centre of the take-up spool here. Let's have a look at that. I have cleaned that, but I'm looking at the state of that. That's got some very hardened grease in there, so I'm just going to... Obviously what I was using before didn't move it. Yeah, that's pretty hardened stuff in there. That's better. Now, a wipe of synthetic grease in the centre. That can go in the back of the camera, like that. Now, assembling the advanced shaft is entertaining. The first thing I've got to deal with is this spring, which, as I say, has had the tab bent or snapped off. That should have engaged with it. So I'm going to see if I can bend that tab into position. Oh, this is always a bit fraught. The chances of the end of the spring just snapping off are pretty high. Alright, so I've bent that out at 90 degrees, that tab on the end of the spring. Now just make sure I know exactly where that goes. That spring the tab has to be at the bottom. Okay. I'm going to put some graphite grease on there because I like the way it works. And this part unfortunately tends to be a bit messy. I'm going to apply some graphite grease to here, where that spring is going to go, and also around the base there where this fits into the bush. This is the messy part because I've got to get that spring over there. Of course it doesn't want to go. I've got to sort of push it coil by coil. And by the time you've done this, most of the graphite grease is no longer on the part, it's on your fingers. Right, that's that. Let's apply a bit more grease to that for good measure. And fit it into the bush. The little tab on the spring should fit into that slot on the bush there. It does. And that should rotate in one direction only, and it does. So that was a success. That's good. Now this little piece here, this is what drives the take-up spool. I was put a little touch of grease on the top of those two pins. And how is this assembled? Well, this goes in from the top. We've got our spring in here, and then this piece. And if we get this correct, yeah. So you can see that when our advanced rewind lever is at one position, let's get this across. Oh, look at that, that's interesting. Okay. This is supposed to be riveted firmly to here. In fact, I think it was squared off at the top before it was, when it was first made. But the lever here is just rotating on the shaft. So I've got to rivet this down hard in order to get that to stop turning, I would say. But basically what's supposed to happen is that as you rotate this, these two tabs are raised and they're no longer in contact with the top of the spool. That's enough for my purposes, because at the moment what I'm most interested in is getting this thing down in place in the body and getting the screws in. So we'll drop that in there, get that spring out from under there. Check that that's engaged in the take-up spool. Yeah, it is. Certainly enough for our purposes. And I'll just get one of these screws in the corner here, and then I'm going to have to deal with that lever. It can come out now anyway. We'll deal with that. Get these other two screws in place. And the spring that's in this mechanism, the coil spring, pushes down on that small drive dog so that it's engaged under normal circumstances. In other words, you turn this shaft, it will rotate the take-up spool, and when the drive dog is lifted out by the action of this piece, then that would allow the spool to rotate backwards. This knob would never rotate backwards because it has that spring, that lock spring at the top of it in the housing, which is there to stop it rotating the wrong way. I don't think we've got enough clearance for this to show you how that works. No, we haven't. We'd have to put something on there. But basically, the knob will rotate one way, but it won't rotate the other. That's all moving smoothly, and as I rotate that, you can see it moving the take-up spool. But this I'm going to have to deal with. So I've got to punch that, but I don't want to damage this thread in any way down at the bottom. So I'll probably have to support it at this point in the vise, and then punched on the top there. And probably if I rivet that down fairly well, that'll stop it turning. Yeah, somebody's done something naughty there, but that's par for the course, particularly for this particular camera. Right, I'll get that job done. Well, a bit of judicious hammering certainly dealt with that. Now if that's screwed in, that would raise that into the rewind position, and that lifts that drive dog out and allows the film take-up spool to rotate backwards nice and smoothly. No turning up here because of course this bracket up here, the take-up spool is got a stop lock in there. It's got that spring that only allows the knob to move in one direction. So just the take-up spool will rotate backwards. And of course, as you unwind this, it allows the dog to drop back down in there, so now that the take-up spool will not roll backwards. So in the advanced position, this is driven by the take-up, by the knob on the top of the film advance here. So that's that little mystery out of the way. That certainly wasn't expecting to find that damage, but that's life as we know it. There's always one more thing. So what have we got on here? Well, we've got a plain washer. Let's spring out from under there. We've got our ratchet wheel, and if I look at the arm, I should be able to tell which way that ratchet wheel works, and it must work that way. And on top of that ratchet wheel there was this disc, and on top of that disc, of course, we would have our take up, the advanced knob, and on top of the advanced knob we would have had our advanced rewind lever here. So that part is looking good. I think the film sprocket can go back on there. So I'll get the components for that. Of course, there was the shaft with the gear on the top, a washer, the sprocket, a plain roller that sat in the bottom position, and there are two tiny screws which I carefully put aside so I wouldn't lose them. So we'll apply a little bit of grease, synthetic grease. I'll apply some to the housing in the top here. That's where the shaft's going to pass through it. And at the bottom of the housing here, right, we can do it from the base plate here. That's where the shaft's going to sit into the bottom of the casting there. And now it's just a case of feeding this in and putting everything in place. I'll just close that front door so I can lie this camera down flat on the front. The first things first, the washer, then the sprocket, then the plain roller. And now I've got to get the holes lined up. Just rotate that shaft until I can see the hole. I can see a hole there. Find the right screwdriver. Yes, it's found the hole in the shaft, so that's firmly fixed. I'll just tighten that screw up. And of course there's one down here on that roller as well. Just trying to get that hole lined up. Here we go. So that's our take up spool, sprocket shaft all back in place. Of course that's rotated by the film, and that in turn rotates the other components which give us our control Yeah, so let's see, we've got the gear that goes on top of there. I'll lubricate that lightly. A bit of synthetic grease, that sits on there like that. We have a washer sitting on top of that, a spacer, and on top of that sits this ring, if I can just get it on the right way round. I'm pretty sure it's this way up. We'll find out shortly if it doesn't work. On top of that, what have we got? We have this spring. Let's just give this a wipe. Does that spring match up with those marks? Yes, it does. And that screw should go in there. So that rotates with the film spool. Take up, that's all looking good. Put a wipe of synthetic grease through the centre of this lever. This lever is held in place, or kept engaged rather, with a spring here, so I might hook that spring out while I can get to it easily. Hook that into position. And the lever fits over the top of that. Of course, I've got to get its spring hooked up too, but we'll get this lever in position. And get its fixing screw in place. That spring has got a bit of a sitting awkwardly there, it's a bit twisted around. See if I can get that sitting better. That's better. That spring has to fit over its post. That went suspiciously well. Anything that goes without a fight's always instantly suspicious. We have a spring here. Does that go up that way? No, it must go up that way. And the shaft, or the axle for that piece. See if we can get that started. Okay, that seems okay. Let's just tighten that up. Now what happens? Let's put the film advance knob on there. If we're advancing the film, the take-up spool's rotating. If I rotate the sprocket shaft with my thumb, the arm drops in, locks the film advance. If I press this, moves our frame counter 1 notch, lifts this arm out, and we can wind on for the next shot. Drops in again. So the film advance is all working correctly. That looks good. I'm using the end of my rule here to tighten that screw down. Make sure that rotates. It does. And that basically is the film advance dealt to. If we wanted to demonstrate the rewind, we can do that. Just tighten that knob down. Okay, so the rewind, I haven't got the bracket on here that holds this in position, but basically to get this in position is always tricky. Something like that. So that's too tight. At the moment that's rewinding, but we're not round to the rewind mark, so I'm one stage too tight there. See if I can get that off and move it. What we're doing is we're working against the spring inside there, which is pushing that dog down, that drive dog down. See if I can get under this lever. I'm at least 1 notch too tight there. Yeah. No, that won't rotate all the way to the R position, so I know I'm too tight. I'm a bit mucked up here because originally this would have been in a certain orientation, and it's no longer in that orientation because there we go, it's no too tight. It's a multi-start thread. I need to be tighter than that. No. No. It's going far enough on one stage too tight. Oh, this is entertaining. Not quite tight enough. Let's try that. That's at the R position. Oh, it's almost but not quite there. Okay. Round at R and it rewinds. Round at A and it doesn't. Okay, so that certainly works. So in the advanced position, it'll advance. You can roll the sprocket wheel around, that locks the film advance. Push the lever to free the winder up to wind your next shot, you can advance again, etc. And to rewind, roll that round to the rewind position, and the spool will rotate backwards. This will always rotate backwards. There's nothing to stop the sprocket shaft and gear here from rotating backwards. And back to the A position, this will no longer rotate backwards, and it's driven by the advance knob. So that part is good. If the top here was correctly oriented, it would probably come round to the R position a little bit neater than it currently does, but not by much. But it basically, mechanically, this is all working. And all that the body here requires is the viewfinder and the top cover here to be cleaned and put back in place. You can see there's an awful lot of dirt and dust in there. The viewfinder you can actually get at from the out. You don't even have to take much off the camera to get to that. It's much easier to do this with this removed from the camera, because if you're trying to do it in place, you can't get a screwdriver in past the knobs at each end to get to these two screws. But we'll take the viewfinder off the top of this and clean everything up.